The Renathar High Palace gleamed like a jewel of excess, its towering spires twisting into the alien sky in a spectacle meant to awe. And yet, as Jane Kovac stepped off the hovering diplomatic platform, the only thing she could focus on was how uncomfortable her shoes were. She had worn them for the aesthetic, stiletto-heeled, sleek black, a subtle power move in a court that prided itself on its overcomplicated robes and jeweled collars. The Renathar had called this meeting to formally assess the worth of humanity, a phrase dripping with condescension. The irony? They thought this was a courtesy. That was their first mistake. The second was assuming Jane was just another bureaucrat. A pair of towering Renathar guards flanked the Grand Hall's entrance, their violet-hued skin nearly blending with the palace's crystalline architecture. Their elongated skulls tilted slightly as they scanned her with golden, pupil-less eyes. To them, she was a curiosity, a small, fragile-looking human female. No exosuit, no bodyguards, just a sleek, black dress and a calm expression. Jane caught one guard sneering. She smiled back, the kind of smile that in human terms meant, "I'm deciding whether or not to break your kneecaps." A procession of alien nobility lined the central hall, each draped in shimmering robes adorned with ridiculous golden filigree. The grandeur was almost comical, like someone had watched an ancient Earth fantasy movie and decided to make it real. The hall itself stretched impossibly long, a deliberate design to make visitors feel small. Jane, however, took her time strolling down it, inspecting the architecture like she was raiding a five-star hotel. At the end of the chamber, seated atop a throne that looked more like an elaborate torture device, was High Overlord Zerlon. He was a massive specimen, even by Renathar standards, his exoskeletal armor polished to a mirror shine. His fingers were long and clawed, adorned with rings that screamed opulence. His deep voice echoed through the hall as he spoke, each syllable drawn out in what she suspected was a rehearsed performance. "Human envoy," he said, his tone brimming with casual disdain. "The Renathar Empire acknowledges your species' survival and its contributions to the galactic community." He waved a clawed hand, the diplomatic equivalent of a lazy shrug. "As an act of generosity, we have granted you this audience." Jane maintained a neutral expression, though inwardly, she was already bored. She had met plenty of pompous bastards before, but Zerlon was shaping up to be top tier. "Grateful as I am for your overwhelming hospitality," she said, deliberately slow, "I was under the impression this was a formal diplomatic discussion, not a charity handout." A ripple of murmurs spread through the court. The Renathar weren't used to being spoken to like this. That was the problem with being a hyper-advanced species that had never lost a war. They never learned how to handle people who weren't intimidated by them. Zerlon let out something between a chuckle and a growl. A diplomat with a sharp tongue. How quaint. He leaned forward, golden eyes narrowing. "Your species is amusing, if nothing else. I have reviewed the records of your wars, your fragile alliances, your chaos. Humans are curious creatures, primitive yet persistent." Jane exhaled slowly. There it was, the superiority complex. "I've also reviewed Renathar history," she said, tilting her head. "Impressive stuff. You conquered entire sectors, subjugated species without breaking a sweat. But from what I can tell, you've never fought humans. I mean really fought them." More murmurs. Zerlon let out a deep, arrogant hum. "Humans are not a military threat to us." Jane smiled. "That's what everyone says. At first." The silence stretched just long enough to be uncomfortable. Jane had played her card, and the Overlord was deciding whether to ignore it or escalate. Then the interruption came. One of the Renathar nobles, a particularly smug-looking one with a high collar and an absurdly large jeweled sash, stepped forward. His voice dripped with derision. "Tell me, human," he sneered, "do all of your species dress so plainly? Or is this some form of protest? It is quite unimpressive." Jane turned to him, slowly, as if giving him the opportunity to reconsider his life choices. He didn't. Instead, he reached for a goblet of something undoubtedly expensive and flicked it at her in an arrogant dismissal. The liquid never hit her. In a movement so fast it barely registered, Jane snatched the goblet mid-air. With the same fluid motion, she twisted her wrist and sent the contents sailing back, directly into the noble's smug, unprepared face. The court gasped. The noble sputtered, his face now dripping in whatever overpriced swill he had been drinking. His expression twisted into rage. "You dare!" Jane didn't let him finish. Her fist connected with his gut in a sharp, controlled jab, knocking the wind out of him. Before he could collapse, she twisted his arm behind his back and gently guided him to his knees. The Renathar were strong, sure, but their noble class? More accustomed to throwing orders than throwing punches. The guards reacted immediately. A dozen of them moved in a blur, energy weapons buzzing to life. Jane moved faster. With a flick of her wrist, she grabbed a fork from the banquet table beside her and threw it with terrifying precision. The tiny piece of cutlery embedded itself into the power module of one guard's weapon, shorting it out in a burst of sparks. She was already moving, heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. The next guard swung a staff. Jane caught it mid-motion, twisted, and used his own momentum to flip him onto the floor with a sickening crack. Another came at her from behind. She ducked, sending him stumbling forward into one of his own comrades. It wasn't a fight. It was a slaughter, and she was smiling. In less than a minute, a full squad of Renathar elite guards were on the floor, groaning in pain. Jane adjusted her dress, rolling her shoulders like she had just finished a particularly satisfying workout. The court was silent. Zerlon's expression had gone from smug superiority to something close to concern. From somewhere in the chamber, a whisper. "She fights like the cursed warlord, the one the Terrans call Baba Yaga." Jane turned towards the whisperer. "Baba, what now?" Another voice, barely audible, trembled. "Baba Yaga, the Terran legend. A death giver, one who cannot be stopped." Jane exhaled through her nose, shaking her head. "That's just a myth." The Renathar didn't look convinced. If anything, they looked more terrified. Zerlon rose from his throne, and for the first time, the confidence was gone. You will leave at once." Jane cracked her knuckles. "Yeah, see, that's the thing. I'm not finished yet." Zerlon hesitated, then gestured sharply to the remaining guards. They didn't move. Jane took a step forward. They took a step back. Smart. The Overlord's jaw clenched, calculating, weighing options. Then, very slowly, he sat back down. "Perhaps further discussion is warranted." Jane smirked. "Now that sounds more like diplomacy." And with that, she turned back to the court, straightened her dress, and took a sip from a goblet she had somehow swiped in the chaos. It tasted terrible. She grimaced. "Seriously, what is wrong with your wine?" Across the Renathar homeworld, the news spread like wildfire. The High Overlord's court, once the untouchable seat of power in the Empire, had been turned into a stage for a terrifying spectacle. The human diplomat had not only humiliated their aristocracy, but dismantled their elite guards with nothing but a fork and a bad attitude. It defied everything the Renathar understood about the universe. Strength came from technology, superior genetics, the inevitability of an empire's dominance. And yet, the human woman, dressed in fragile cloth and standing no taller than their adolescent youth, had rendered them powerless. The security footage leaked within the hour. It was bad enough that a single human had bested them in combat. But the way she did it? Effortlessly, casually, as if she had barely broken a sweat. The holovid clips circulated at light speed through the Galactic net, each replay focusing on different parts of the disaster. One feed zoomed in on the moment she caught the thrown goblet midair, reversing its trajectory in a single fluid motion. Another slowed down the footage of her throwing a dining utensil into a guard's power module, disabling his weapon in a way that made every military engineer in the Empire weep. And then there was the most damning footage of all, the close-up of High Overlord Zerlon's expression as he watched his guards crumple before the woman humans called Baba Yaga. The Empire's response was immediate. Inside the Renathar Grand War Council chamber, Zerlon sat upon a throne far more practical than his ostentatious court seat. This one was simple, reinforced, made for real matters of state. The air in the chamber was thick with unease. the kind that came when beings who considered themselves untouchable were suddenly forced to acknowledge their vulnerability. Before him, his highest-ranking generals, intelligence officials, and advisors stood in anxious silence, waiting for him to speak. The holoscreens above the grand table played endless loops of the incident, as it had come to be called. "She is but one human," the High Overlord said finally, his deep voice barely concealing his irritation. "One. And yet my palace guards fell like hatchlings before her." A thick silence followed. No one dared argue. One of his war strategists, General Vrax, cleared his throat and gestured to a new data screen. It displayed human military history, a list that stretched far longer than anyone was comfortable with. "We've had human conflicts documented before," Vrax said. "But after this, I conducted a deeper analysis. What I found was," he hesitated, his mandibles twitching, "troubling." Zurlon narrowed his golden eyes. "Explain." Vrax took a breath. "Historically, human civilizations have spent most of their recorded existence fighting. Not merely skirmishes or political disputes. Total wars. Their own history describes conflicts that resulted in devastation beyond reason, yet they kept fighting. They do not break under pressure the way other species do. They evolve from it." Zurlon's claws tapped against the armrest of his throne. "Surely, their weapons pale in comparison to ours." "That was my assumption as well," Vrax admitted, "until I researched their tactics." He pressed a button, pulling up a historical reel. The images that followed were grainy, ancient by Renathar standards, yet chilling. Soldiers storming beaches under a storm of enemy fire, human-built tanks rolling through ruined cities, warships locked in brutal dogfights in a void of space. But what unsettled the Council most was the sheer variety. Humanity fought in every condition, underwater, underground, in frozen wastelands, in burning deserts, against overwhelming odds, against enemies that outnumbered and outgunned them. And they won. One council member shifted uncomfortably. Surely that is only their past. They have evolved beyond such barbarism. Vrax switched to a new screen. "This is a classified file on the Terran Special Operations Division, the modern branch of their military. Their elite warriors are trained under conditions designed to break lesser beings. Zero-gravity combat, prolonged survival under extreme conditions, hand-to-hand combat training, that is." He glanced at the playback of the incident again. "Well, you've seen the results." Zurlon exhaled slowly. "And this? Jane Kovac. Who is she?" A sharp beep interrupted the discussion. A nervous intelligence officer stepped forward, holding a data slate as if it were radioactive. "We've found a record," he said hesitantly. "She is, as she claimed, a diplomat." However, he swallowed hard. Before she entered diplomatic service, she was a classified operative under the Terran Black Ops Initiative. Silence. Zurlon exhaled slowly, his claws gripping the armrests of his throne. "And what precisely does a Black Ops operative do?" The intelligence officer looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "Sir, their official duties include espionage, assassination, infiltration, and sabotage." "Their unofficial duties," he hesitated. "Sir, I believe the humans have a term for it. I think it's called wet work." The chamber grew deathly still. Zurlon's expression darkened. He turned back to the holofeed. The human woman stood at the center of the image, dusting off her hands, bored, as if she had just finished taking out the trash. A diplomat, they had thought, and she had still dismantled them without effort. "If this is what a diplomat is capable of," Zurlon murmured, more to himself than to the council, "what are their soldiers like?" A terrifying thought, and a thought that had already begun spreading across the Empire. Across Renathar-controlled space, paranoia seeped into every rank. Soldiers whispered among themselves in barracks, sharing exaggerated tales of human resilience. Entire outposts questioned their preparedness. Were their training simulations enough? Would their armor withstand human combat techniques? Rumors bred faster than facts, and within hours, a new myth was already taking shape. The humans had unleashed their war goddess upon them. On the fringes of Renathar territory, distant warlords laughed. The Kroll Dominion, A brutal race that had once attempted to invade Earth and suffered an embarrassing retreat, issued a public statement. We tried. We barely survived. If the Renathar want to test humanity, we will gladly watch from the sidelines. Even minor spacefaring species, those who had never dared challenge the Renathar Empire, began reconsidering their alliances. And amidst all of this chaos, Jane Kovac, she was sitting in the Overlord's personal dining hall, drinking alien wine and casually hijacking Renathar security feeds from a stolen datapad. The Overlord had ordered her to leave his palace. She had ignored him. Now, she scrolled through Renathar news feeds, laughing at the panic her little diplomatic discussion had caused. Hashtags like hashtag Baba Yaga returns and hashtag humans are scary flooded the Galactic net. A sharp beep interrupted her amusement. An incoming call from Earth. She answered with a lazy flick of her wrist, tilting the screen just enough to see the face of the Terran president. He looked mildly entertained. "So," he said, folding his hands together, "I just got a rather frantic message from the Renathar High Command. Something about an act of war." Jane sipped her stolen wine. That sounds about right." A pause. The president sighed. "Do I even want to know?" Jane grinned. "Let's just say negotiations got lively." The president pinched the bridge of his nose. "I assume you have some sort of plan." She leaned back, smirking. "Oh, don't worry. I do." And that was the truth. Because if the Renathar Empire thought they could control this situation, they were about to learn something very, very important. You don't start a fight with a human and expect it to go the way you planned. The Renathar Grand War Council had spent the past 12 hours locked in a desperate strategy session, and the mood had only soured with each passing minute. The usual arrogance, the deep-seated belief that the Empire could crush any enemy, had been replaced with something far more unfamiliar. Uncertainty. Fear. Zurlon sat rigid on his throne, his golden eyes fixed on the growing list of military assessments scrolling before him. The data was supposed to reassure him. It didn't. His advisors had compiled every scrap of intelligence available on the Terran military, searching for weaknesses, patterns, anything that might suggest humans were not the nightmare they now appeared to be. Instead, the list of human victories read like something out of a horror chronicle. They had fought wars not just on their own world, but in the cold void of space, on barren moons, and even against enemies technologically superior to them. They had won those wars not through sheer firepower alone, but through an unholy mixture of adaptability, stubbornness, and outright madness. And now one of them, just one, had walked into his palace and shattered the illusion of Renathar superiority in a matter of minutes. Zurlon exhaled, slow and deliberate. "Tell me," he said finally, his voice low, "how would we fare in a war against humanity?" The chamber was silent for a long time before General Vrax, the only one with the spine to answer, cleared his throat. "On paper, we outmatch them. Our fleet is larger. Our weapons are more advanced." Zurlon leaned forward. "And yet," Vrax hesitated, "and yet every simulation in which we engage humanity in open war ends the same way." "Which is?" Vrax met his gaze. "We lose." The statement settled over the chamber like a death knell. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Zurlon's jaw clenched. "That is unacceptable." "I agree, Supreme Overlord," Vrax said carefully. "Which is why I strongly advise against starting a war with them." The absurdity of the situation was not lost on anyone in the room. The Renathar Empire, the most dominant force in the known galaxy, was actively discussing how to avoid war with a species that, until now, they had considered barely worth acknowledging. Zurlon's claws tapped against the armrest of his throne. "Then we must find another way." A sharp chime interrupted the tension, and a holoscreen flared to life in the center of the chamber. Every Renathar in the room stiffened as they saw the unmistakable outline of an approaching fleet. The Terran diplomatic armada had arrived. No shields were raised, no weapons primed for battle, but the sheer presence of human warships hovering at the edge of their capital system was enough to send a ripple of dread through the Renathar command. A communication request flashed onto the screen. For the first time in 1,000 cycles, Zerlon hesitated before answering. The screen flickered, revealing the face of the Terran president. He was an older human, graying at the temples, dressed in the simple yet authoritative uniform of his office. His expression was unreadable, but the glint in his eyes spoke volumes. "Overlord Zerlon," he greeted smoothly. "I trust my envoy has made quite the impression." The phrasing was deliberate. My envoy, not your prisoner, not a foreign diplomat. A clear reminder that Jane Kovac was not alone in this. Zerlon folded his hands together, willing his expression to remain neutral. "She has certainly left an impact." The president's lips twitched, the ghost of a smile. "That's what I hear." He leaned back slightly. "So, let's talk about what happens next." Zerlon's jaw tensed. "What exactly is your proposal?" The president's gaze sharpened. "Here's the thing. Earth has no interest in war. We're not looking for enemies. But," he gestured vaguely, "you did attack our diplomat, which, as you can imagine, puts us in an awkward position." Zerlon did not respond. The president continued. "Now technically we could demand reparations, or a formal apology, or any number of bureaucratic gestures." He smiled. "But we both know that's not really what's happening here." Zerlon exhaled slowly. "You want something." The president tilted his head slightly. "I do want something, Overlord. I want your empire to understand exactly what kind of mistake you almost made." Zerlon stiffened. "Is that a threat?" The president chuckled. "No, it's a courtesy." That made the Overlord pause. The president clasped his hands together. "Let's be honest with each other, shall we? Your people underestimated us. That happens. But now you have a choice. You can keep pretending you hold all the cards, or," he let the word hang, "you can do what smart leaders do. Adapt." Zerlon studied him carefully. He could feel the weight of his own council's eyes on him, waiting to see his next move. He had never been forced into a diplomatic surrender before. But then again, he had never faced humans before. Slowly, deliberately, he exhaled. "What are your terms?" The president smiled. "Simple. We establish formal diplomatic relations, trade agreements, military non-aggression pacts." And his eyes gleamed with amusement. "You personally extend a public recognition of humanity as a major galactic power." Zerlon's claws flexed against the throne's surface. The humiliation of it burned, but the alternative burned worse. He had no choice. "Very well." His voice was stiff, but controlled. "Consider it done." The president nodded once. "Glad to hear it." He leaned back, casual once more. "Oh, and one more thing." Zerlon barely managed to contain his irritation. "Yes." The president smirked. "I want you to personally present Jane Kovac with an honorary title." Zerlon blinked. "An honorary title?" "Yep," the president said cheerfully. "Something suitably grand. Maybe Supreme Lady of Unholy Retribution." "Just spitballing here." Zerlon stared at him. The president shrugged. "Think of it as a goodwill gesture." A low growl rumbled in the Overlord's throat. But, ultimately, he had no room to argue. So he gave the humans their damn title. And across the galaxy, the legend of Baba Yaga only grew. The Renathar capital had never been so quiet. For a world known for its grand proclamations, its endless parades of dominance, its self-assured belief that it was the pinnacle of civilization, the silence was deafening. And yet, it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of an empire holding its breath. Across the palace, across the planet, across the entire Renathar dominion, whispers of a new name had taken root, spreading faster than any official decree. Baba Yaga, the Terran war goddess, the death giver, the unbreakable storm clad in fragile flesh. Jane Kovac was still standing in the Overlord's hall, sipping another goblet of alien wine, though this time, it was offered to her rather than stolen. It still tasted terrible. She sipped it anyway, because at this point it was funny. The official diplomatic signing had just concluded. The treaty had been sealed, the formal recognition of human power cemented in intergalactic law. The Renathar were now locked into an alliance they had never intended, their military hands forced into a handshake rather than a clenched fist. And at the center of it all, her. Jane glanced sideways at the gilded plaque the Renathar had just presented to her. Supreme Lady of Unholy Retribution. She snorted. You guys really ran with that one, huh? Zerlon, who had personally handed her the plaque with a kind of expression usually reserved for funerals, merely clenched his jaw. The Overlord had no retort, no cutting remark left in him. The weight of what had just transpired was still settling into his bones. Across the hall, his advisors and generals stood in varying states of what the hell just happened. The strongest warriors in their empire, the most intelligent tacticians, the most cold-blooded diplomats, all reduced to spectators in a story that had completely escaped their control. Jane turned to the president's holofeed. So, I assume I'm getting a raise after this. The president, still smirking, shook his head. You're getting a planet-wide holiday named after you. That made her pause. You're joking. Nope. Kovac Day just got unanimous approval. He chuckled. Your face is currently being turned into a historical holostamp. Jane blinked, then sighed. I really need to stop doing my job this well. The Renathar nobles were still trying to process all of it. They had begun the day thinking themselves untouchable, unshakable, unchallenged. Now they were looking at a human with something they had never felt before. Not just respect, not just fear, reverence. She had walked into their court, fought their warriors, faced down their leader, and left with everything she wanted. Not just a victory, but a legend. A Renathar noble, still trembling slightly, leaned towards his companion. The humans, do you think they have more like her? His companion swallowed. I think they have worse. Outside, in the void of space, the Terran diplomatic armada still hovered ominously. None of the warships had fired a single shot. None of them had needed to. They were there as a reminder, a silent, looming message to the rest of the galaxy. Mess with one human? You mess with all of them. Galactic news networks were already exploding with coverage. Analysts scrambled to make sense of what had happened. Alien species from every corner of the known universe tuned in, captivated, unable to look away. Commentators debated fiercely. Some called it the greatest diplomatic maneuver in modern history. Others called it the day the Renathar Empire had quietly surrendered without a war. The memes, however, were the real problem. Within hours, the galactic net was flooded with Terran jokes. A single human walked into the most powerful empire in the galaxy and left with their lunch money. Renathar Empire? More like Renathar employees. Never bring a war fleet to a fork fight. There was even a trending phrase among younger alien species. What would Baba Yaga do? The Renathar Empire had been undefeated for millennia. Now, they had become a punchline. Zerlon knew what this meant. Knew that no matter how much they tried to spin it, the balance of power had shifted. Every other galactic power now saw them differently. Once, they had been the looming threat. Now, they were the ones who had blinked first. And as for humanity, they were no longer just another species. They were the new, unknown. Jane watched the tension spread through the room, the realization sinking into the Renathar hierarchy. She could have let them stew in it, let the fear do all the work. But that wasn't her style. She clinked her wine glass against the overlords. Cheer up, big eye, she said, grinning. At least I didn't take the throne. Zerlon turned his gaze toward her, expression unreadable. I am beginning to think you could have. Jane considered that for a moment. Then she shrugged. Maybe next time. And with that, she turned on her heel, heading for the exit. The human fleet awaited her. The stars stretched before her, endless, untamed, full of opportunity. And if the galaxy had learned anything today, it was this. Humans were just getting started.